The morning sun had barely risen over New York City when the CNN building on Columbus Circle began to stir with unusual energy. In the control room, producers moved briskly from station to station, checking cameras, adjusting lights, and confirming live broadcast feeds. The air was electric, humming with the kind of quiet tension that always preceded a major interview. But this one was different. Today's guest wasn't a politician or a corporate leader. It was Meghan Markle. Her team had confirmed her appearance days earlier, framing it as a conversation about humanitarian projects and her upcoming foundation initiative. On paper, it was meant to be calm, polished, and safe. But everyone at CNN knew that when Meghan appeared anywhere, safety was an illusion. Her name drew both admiration and controversy in equal measure. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, carried weight far beyond the walls of a studio. And sitting across from her would be Anderson Cooper, calm, meticulous, and famously unflinching. Over the years, he had interviewed presidents, survivors, and celebrities with the same measured tone. He never shouted, never mocked, never sensationalized, but his questions could slice through rehearsed talking points like glass through silk. That was why people trusted him and why guests often feared him. In the green room, Meghan sat in front of the mirror as a stylist made a final adjustment to her hair. The bright studio lights from down the hall spilled faintly through the open door. She looked calm, but her reflection betrayed subtle tension. Her posture was straight, her smile practiced, but her eyes revealed the storm of calculation behind them. She knew exactly what this interview represented. A chance to reclaim the narrative, to remind the public of her voice, not the tabloids, not the gossip columns, not the internet's endless commentary, but her own. Her team had advised her to stay positive, to avoid reacting to provocation, to speak only in measured tones. She had nodded along to every word of advice, but deep down, she knew how quickly that kind of discipline could crumble under pressure. The producer stepped into the doorway. "We're ready for you, Duchess," she said politely, though her voice carried a note of nervous respect. Meghan stood up, smoothed the lapel of her cream-colored blazer, and walked toward the stage with a measured calm that was almost cinematic. On the studio floor, Anderson sat at the circular desk, reviewing his note cards. His demeanor was the same as always, composed, cool, quietly focused. He wasn't preparing to ambush her, but he also wasn't planning to let the conversation stay shallow. To him, every interview was a search for truth, not theater. But truth and reputation rarely walked hand in hand, and today that difference would matter. The studio lights brightened to a perfect daylight tone. The CNN logo pulsed faintly on the giant LED screen behind them. Crew members called out final cues. 2 minutes to live, standby graphics, audio clear. Camera 3 ready for intro. Anderson looked up from his notes as Meghan took her seat across from him. They exchanged a brief handshake, polite, cordial, even warm. The kind of handshake that lasted exactly long enough for the cameras to capture it. Then the stage manager counted down. In 5, 4, 3... The familiar CNN music cue faded, and Anderson turned to face the camera with his signature calm introduction. "Good morning. Today we're joined by a woman who has inspired, divided, and fascinated the world. Former actress, philanthropist, and Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle." The camera panned to her as she smiled graciously. "Thank you for having me," she said, her voice smooth, perfectly balanced between warmth and composure. For the first few minutes, everything went as planned. They talked about her foundation's upcoming work in education and women's empowerment. Meghan spoke clearly, confident, and eloquent, highlighting her team's projects in underprivileged communities. Anderson nodded thoughtfully, giving her room to express her ideas. But even then, there was an unspoken rhythm building between them, the push and pull of professionalism and curiosity. Meghan's words flowed like a well-rehearsed speech, while Anderson listened with the quiet patience of someone waiting for the moment when the conversation turned real. At the 8-minute mark, that moment arrived. Anderson shifted his tone slightly, his voice lowering just enough to signal transition. "You've done many interviews over the past few years," he began, "and your relationship with the media has been a constant topic. Some people admire your transparency, others question your intentions. Do you think the public misunderstands you?" Meghan took a breath. "I think misunderstanding comes with visibility," she said. "People project what they want to see." I've accepted that not everyone will believe in me or like me, but what matters is staying true to purpose. Anderson nodded, then followed quickly. That's fair, but do you ever feel responsible for feeding that cycle? You've spoken about wanting privacy, yet you've also chosen to share deeply personal stories on public platforms. The question hung in the air. Meghan's expression stayed still for a heartbeat too long before she replied. Privacy doesn't mean silence, she said carefully. It means having control over your story. There's a difference between choosing to speak and being spoken for. Anderson leaned forward slightly. But to some viewers, that distinction feels blurred. They see a public figure who criticizes the spotlight while continuing to stand in it. What would you say to them? The tension was subtle but palpable. Meghan smiled faintly, though the corners of her eyes tightened. I'd say that's an oversimplification. My life isn't a contradiction, it's a human experience. You can want boundaries and still use your voice. He nodded. But do you think that sometimes those boundaries become selective? Her smile faded. Selective? Yes, Anderson said calmly. You've spoken about injustice and public intrusion, but you've also shared deeply personal moments in documentaries and interviews. Some critics say that's using trauma as branding. Do you see how that might look? There it was, the shift, the line between politeness and confrontation. Meghan sat back slightly. I share my story because it's mine, it's not marketing. It's truth. When women tell their stories, people call it self-promotion. When men do, they call it courage. A murmur of approval ran through a few crew members in the back, though they quickly quieted. Anderson stayed still, his expression unreadable. That's a powerful point, he said, but you must admit perception is powerful too, and perception shapes legacy. Meghan tilted her head. Maybe. But legacy means nothing if it's built on lies. For a brief moment, the tension cracked. The camera caught the faintest twitch in Anderson's jaw, not irritation, but interest. This was the kind of raw honesty he thrived on. He pressed on. You've spoken about compassion, but you've also been criticized for dividing people, including within your own family. Do you ever wonder if your way of communicating your truth has created more walls than bridges? The question hit harder than the others. Meghan's expression faltered for the first time. She took a deep breath before answering. I think people who have never lived under constant judgment have no idea what it takes to stay standing. I've tried to build bridges, but not everyone wants peace. Some prefer conflict because it keeps the story alive. Anderson didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, You talk about judgment, but many people feel judged by you as if disagreement equals cruelty. Do you ever think about that? The silence that followed was heavy. Meghan's lips parted slightly, but no immediate answer came. Her gaze dropped toward the table for a brief second before lifting again. I think compassion works both ways, she said finally, but it's hard to give compassion to people who have never offered you any. Anderson nodded once slowly. That's honest. The producer in the booth whispered into the headset, We're still rolling, stay wide shot. The segment had already gone longer than scheduled, but no one dared interrupt. The tension wasn't chaos, it was control. Controlled discomfort, balanced perfectly on the edge of civility. Meghan adjusted her blazer, her tone softening again. At the end of the day, I want my work to speak louder than the noise. The rest doesn't matter, Anderson smiled faintly. The noise is hard to ignore when you're at the center of it. For the first time, Meghan's eyes flashed with something sharper, not anger exactly, but defiance. Then maybe people should stop mistaking attention for intent, she said. I never asked for obsession, I asked for understanding. The line sounded rehearsed, yet heartfelt. The audience at home would likely interpret it both ways, and Anderson knew it. That was why he paused before delivering his next question, a question that would become the pivot of the entire broadcast. He leaned forward slightly. Do you think your story would carry the same power if you weren't married to a prince? The words landed like a cold gust across the studio. Meghan's expression froze. For a moment she didn't move, didn't blink. The cameras caught it all, the stillness, the silent shock, the flicker of calculation in her eyes as she weighed how to respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but controlled. My worth isn't defined by my marriage, she said. I was a woman with a purpose before I met my husband. That hasn't changed. Anderson's expression remained neutral. Then what would you say to people who believe your platform exists because of that title? Meghan exhaled through her nose, her patience clearly thinning. I'd say the same thing I always do. Power isn't given, it's used. What matters is how you use it. The producer's voice crackled in the headset again. Wrap soon. But Anderson wasn't finished. One last question, he said. When you look back at all of this, the fame, the criticism, the opportunities, do you ever regret stepping into the public eye? For a long moment, she didn't answer. Her gaze drifted slightly, as if she were looking past him, past the studio, past the lights. No, she said finally. I regret how cruel people became when I did, but not the choice itself. Because if even one girl feels stronger because she saw me stand my ground, then it's worth it. Anderson nodded once. That's a powerful answer. The music cue swelled softly in the background. The director signaled the transition to break. The red light above the camera dimmed, signaling the segment's end. As soon as the broadcast cut, the tension inside the studio seemed to evaporate into the cool hum of machines and muted chatter. Meghan looked down briefly, smoothing the fabric of her blazer again. Anderson offered a polite nod, but neither spoke. The silence between them carried more weight than any question asked. Behind the glass, the producers began whispering urgently. That was incredible television, one of them said. She handled it well, but the clips are going to explode. They were right. The interview hadn't been fiery or loud, but it had carried the kind of quiet friction that audiences devoured, dignity meeting scrutiny, truth meeting perception. And while the cameras rested, and the lights dimmed for commercial, everyone in that studio knew one thing for certain: this story wasn't over. The lights flickered back to full brightness as the red tally light above the center camera blinked again. The broadcast was live once more. Anderson Cooper's face returned to the screen, calm and professional as ever, his tone perfectly measured. The commercial break had given everyone in the studio a moment to breathe, but the energy hadn't reset. It lingered in the air like static. The polite distance between Anderson and Meghan was thinner now, charged with unspoken tension. Anderson's voice carried that familiar steadiness as he began the next segment. Welcome back to CNN this morning. We're here with Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, discussing her foundation's initiatives and life in the public eye. He paused just long enough to let the words sink in. Then his tone shifted slightly. Before the break, we spoke about purpose and perception. I'd like to go a little deeper into that. Meghan smiled, though her eyes were sharper now. She leaned forward slightly. Of course. Anderson clasped his hands together on the desk, looking down briefly at his note cards before meeting her gaze. You've become one of the most talked-about figures in the world, admired by some, criticized by others. Do you feel misunderstood, or do you think some of that attention comes from choices you've made yourself? The question was polite, but it cut deep. Meghan took a breath before answering. I think being misunderstood is the price of being visible, she said carefully. When you stand for something, people will twist it. That's the world we live in. Anderson nodded slowly, as though weighing her words. That may be true, he said, but some would argue that visibility is also something you've embraced. The documentaries, the interviews, the memoirs, they've kept you in the spotlight you say you dislike. Do you see why people struggle to reconcile those two things? Meghan's smile stayed in place, but it didn't reach her eyes. I share my story on my terms, she replied. That's very different from living for the spotlight. Anderson leaned forward slightly. But doesn't constant storytelling risk becoming performance? When every moment becomes content, doesn't it blur the line between truth and presentation? Her jaw tightened. I think you're confusing transparency with strategy, she said evenly. When men share their struggles, they're called brave. When women do it, they're called calculated. That double standard is the real problem. The room grew still. The producer in the control booth leaned toward her monitor, whispering to her colleague, She's holding her ground. This is going to trend. Anderson nodded thoughtfully. I understand your point, he said. But some of your critics aren't talking about gender. They're talking about consistency. They say you speak about compassion and kindness, yet some of your public moments seem defensive or even dismissive. What do you say to that? Meghan inhaled deeply. I say people forget I'm human, she replied. When you're constantly attacked, defending yourself isn't cruelty, it's survival. The irony is that the same people who accuse me of being defensive are often the ones who keep attacking. Anderson held her gaze for a moment. But do you think defending yourself has sometimes overshadowed your message? Meghan's tone softened, but her eyes remained steady. I think the world is very uncomfortable with a woman who refuses to shrink. If that overshadows the message, then maybe people should ask why they're so distracted by the messenger. A murmur of approval came from somewhere in the audience seating area. Anderson waited until it died down before speaking again. His tone stayed controlled, but the edge had returned. "You've said that your family faced cruelty from the media," he said. "But others argue that you've used the media to shape your image when it suits you. How do you respond to that?" Meghan's expression didn't change, but her posture did. She sat a little straighter, her voice quieter now. "I don't control the media. I've tried to correct lies, yes, but that's not the same thing as manipulating coverage. The difference is intent. Mine is to protect the truth. Theirs is to profit from distortion." Anderson gave a small nod. "You've made your case many times about the toll that took on you personally," he said. "But what about the toll it's taken on others? Your departure from the royal family caused strain, personal, public, institutional. Do you feel any regret for how it unfolded?" Meghan's lips parted slightly, then pressed together again. For the first time, her confidence wavered just enough for the camera to catch it. "I regret that people got hurt," she said after a pause. "But I can't regret seeking peace. That's not betrayal, that's self-preservation." Anderson's voice lowered. "And yet to some it did feel like betrayal. Especially toward the institution that gave you that platform in the first place." Meghan's eyes sharpened. "The platform came with a price," she said. "A price no one should have to pay." The exchange had turned heavier now. Even the camera operators were holding their breath between angles. The studio had become a battlefield of silence and precision. Anderson continued, his tone deceptively gentle. "I understand your frustration with the press. But do you ever worry that focusing on your struggle has taken attention away from the causes you care about? That people now associate you more with controversy than charity?" Meghan leaned back in her chair. "I can't control what people choose to focus on," she said. "I can only keep doing the work. My worth isn't measured by headlines." Anderson nodded slightly. "And yet the headlines seem to follow you everywhere." "Doesn't that tell you something?" Meghan's reply came quickly. "It tells me the world still treats women who speak up as entertainment." The moment landed with precision. The audience, sensing the rising tension, stayed silent. The atmosphere was thick, electric. Every line from her and every pause from him seemed calculated for effect. Anderson, however, wasn't finished. "You've used your platform to challenge injustice," he said. "But some argue that you've also personalized the struggle, that your message has become less about global issues and more about your own pain. Is that fair?" Meghan blinked slowly. "I talk about my experiences because that's the only truth I can own. If people see themselves in it, then I've done something good. But I can't apologize for feeling deeply." Anderson studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough," he said. "But I wonder, do you ever think your message might resonate more if you spoke less about yourself and more about the work?" The question hit like a spark. Meghan's smile faded completely now. "That's an interesting way to frame it," she said slowly. "But I don't separate the work from the person doing it. My voice is part of the cause, trying to silence that would only serve the same system that tried to silence me before." Anderson tilted his head. "So criticism is oppression?" Her tone turned firm. "Criticism is fine when it's fair, but constant character assassination isn't criticism. It's cruelty disguised as analysis." The studio lights felt hotter now, almost oppressive. The tension wasn't just between them anymore. It filled the air like humidity before a storm. Meghan's team, watching from the control booth, exchanged nervous looks. They could see it building. The moment where calm civility turned into confrontation. Anderson's next words carried the weight of inevitability. "Some would say," he began slowly, "that you've played a role in that narrative too. That the more you push back, the more it keeps the story alive." Meghan gave a small laugh, but it had no humor. "So if I stay silent, I'm complicit. If I speak up, I'm the problem." "Interesting logic, isn't it?" Anderson's gaze didn't waver. "It's the paradox of fame," he said simply. There was a long pause, the kind that made even the technicians shift uncomfortably. Meghan crossed one leg over the other, resting her hands on her knee. Her tone lowered to almost a whisper. "Maybe fame should never have been the story. Maybe compassion should have been." Anderson leaned back, his expression neutral. "But compassion isn't what drives ratings," he said, almost as if thinking aloud. "Conflict does, and you become very good at surviving conflict." Her eyes narrowed. Surviving isn't the same as thriving, Anderson. The exchange hung in the air. Neither spoke for several seconds. It was television perfection, real emotion, silence, and intensity in every frame. Finally, Anderson spoke again, his voice softer now. "You seem tired," he said. "Do you ever wish you could go back to the beginning, before the cameras, before the titles, before the scrutiny?" Meghan's eyes drifted slightly away from him. "I think everyone wishes for simpler times," she said. "But you can't unsee what you've lived through. You can only learn from it." Anderson nodded. "And what's the biggest lesson you've learned?" Her voice was quieter now, more reflective. "That the truth isn't loud, it doesn't fight for space. It just waits to be heard." The crew in the booth exchanged glances. One whispered, "That's the headline." But Anderson's expression told a different story. He wasn't looking for sound bites, he was testing truth. "That's beautifully said," he replied, "but truth also invites challenge, and not everyone agrees with your version of it." Meghan's patience cracked slightly. "Then they can live their truth," she said sharply. "I'm done apologizing for mine." Anderson's gaze stayed steady, unshaken. "That's fair," he said calmly, "but when truth becomes personal branding, people start questioning the motive." That was the line. The moment the temperature shifted completely, Meghan's eyes flashed. "My motive," she repeated. "You think it's about fame, about attention? That's insulting." Anderson didn't flinch. "I'm not saying that's true, I'm saying that's how some people perceive it. And perception shapes influence." The silence that followed was absolute. Meghan's expression hardened, her composure beginning to fracture. She forced a smile that didn't hide the tremor in her voice. "Perception is shaped by those with power," she said. "And it's always women who get punished for using theirs." Anderson's final words before the break were quiet but sharp. "Or maybe it's those who mistake influence for immunity." The cameras zoomed in on Meghan's face just as the music cue faded in. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of shock, restraint, and pride. The red tally light dimmed, signaling commercial. Inside the booth, the producer exhaled. "This is getting heavy," she whispered. One of the camera operators looked toward Anderson's desk and muttered, "He's pushing her to the edge." Another replied, "She's not backing down, though." They were both right. The interview had crossed from conversation into confrontation. And as Meghan sat in silence, adjusting her posture and steadying her breath before the next segment, she realized something. She wasn't in control anymore, but she wasn't defeated either. The next round would decide everything. Anderson Cooper might have set the pace, but Meghan Markle was ready to take it back. The commercial break ended, and the red tally light blinked once more. The cameras came alive, capturing the same pristine set, the same gleaming table, and the same two faces, but something in the air had changed. The calm professionalism from earlier had dissolved into tension, so thick it could almost be felt through the television screen. Anderson Cooper sat composed, hands folded, expression steady. Across from him, Meghan Markle straightened her posture, her smile perfectly in place yet visibly colder than before. Every viewer watching at home could feel it. This was no longer just an interview. It was a battle for control unfolding live. Anderson began the segment with his usual smooth tone, but there was something sharper beneath it now. "We're back with Meghan Markle," he said. "Before the break, we talked about truth, perception, and what it means to control your own narrative. I want to go deeper into that idea of control." Meghan nodded, waiting for the question. Anderson glanced down at his notes, then back up. "You've spoken a lot about empowerment, but some people see your story as one of rejection, rejecting family, tradition, even the media that once supported you. Do you ever worry that what you call freedom, others see as abandonment?" The words were soft but deliberate. Meghan held her composure, though the flicker in her eyes betrayed irritation. "People who say that are usually the ones who have never been trapped," she said calmly. "They confuse obedience with loyalty. I walked away from a system that didn't want me to survive." "That's not abandonment, that's self-respect." Anderson nodded slightly. "But walking away came with consequences. There are still people who say you wanted the benefits of royalty without the responsibility that comes with it." Meghan's voice lowered. "I earned everything I've built," she said. "Nothing was handed to me. People think being part of that institution means protection, but it was the opposite. I was constantly fighting just to exist." Anderson leaned forward. "Do you think the public's criticism comes from misunderstanding your struggle, or from how they've seen it presented?" In interviews, documentaries, podcasts, books. Meghan exhaled slowly. It comes from people being told what to think. The media doesn't report my life, they rewrite it. He nodded again, his voice calm but firm. You've been open about the media's role in your pain. But do you accept that your own media appearances also shape that narrative? You have influence that most people don't. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You're suggesting that speaking about my experiences fuels the problem, she said. But silence is how the problem began. You can't heal by hiding. Anderson's tone didn't shift. Yet sometimes healing requires stepping away. Have you ever considered that constant exposure, even in defense, might be doing the opposite? The studio was silent. Crew members in the booth watched the monitors like hawks. Every sentence was sharper than the last, slicing through the air with quiet precision. Meghan clasped her hands together on the table. I understand what you're trying to say, but I think it's unfair, she said. You're implying that the only way for me to have peace is to disappear. That's not a solution. That's surrender. Anderson tilted his head slightly. Or maybe it's restraint, he said softly. That single word lingered in the air like smoke. The camera zoomed in on Meghan's face, her eyes hard, her posture unyielding. She took a moment before responding. Restraint is what I practiced for years, she said. It didn't stop the lies, it didn't stop the headlines, it didn't stop the hate. People talk about restraint when it's women speaking, but when men speak out, it's called courage. I'm done living by that double standard. The audience watching at home could feel the rising pulse of emotion behind her words. Anderson, ever steady, gave a small nod. That's a fair point, he said, but I think viewers also want accountability. They've seen how every story you tell shapes perception, sometimes against others who can't respond. Does that responsibility ever weigh on you? Her expression hardened. You mean the royal family, she said quietly. Anderson didn't deny it. They've chosen not to respond publicly, he said. But their silence leaves your version as the dominant one. Is that fair? Meghan's jaw tightened. Fair, she repeated. Where was fairness when I was being torn apart every day? Where was fairness when I was pregnant and suicidal and nobody cared? Fairness doesn't exist in that world. It never did. Anderson stayed quiet for a moment, letting her words settle. That's powerful, he said. But by continuing to revisit it, are you healing or reopening the wound for the world to see again? Meghan's voice shook slightly, not from weakness but from restrained anger. Healing doesn't look neat, she said. It's messy, painful, and public when your life has been publicized against your will. I don't owe anyone silence just because it makes them comfortable. Anderson watched her carefully. He could see the fire behind her calm exterior. So speaking out is part of your healing? He asked. She nodded once. It's how I take back power, she said, because for too long people tried to take my voice from me. The pause that followed was long enough for viewers to feel it. Anderson's next question would decide the tone for the rest of the interview. Meghan, he said finally, you've said before that you want to inspire compassion. But when people watch moments like this, tense, defensive, emotional, do you worry the message gets lost? That they see conflict instead of compassion. The room went quiet. Even the hum of the studio lights seemed louder. Meghan leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but fierce. Compassion doesn't mean compliance, she said. It means standing firm even when it's uncomfortable. People want women to be gentle when they're attacked. I won't apologize for defending myself. Anderson nodded slightly, then said, Some viewers might see that as defiance rather than strength. Meghan didn't hesitate. Defiance built every woman who ever changed the world, she said. The control room erupted in whispers. That's the clip, a producer muttered. That's the headline. But the interview wasn't over. Anderson had one more card to play. He adjusted his earpiece and said quietly, I want to show you something. The screen behind them lit up, displaying a montage of news headlines from the past year, stories about Meghan, both supportive and critical. The sound was muted, but the words were visible. Publicity or purpose? Royal or rebel? Meghan's media paradox. The camera returned to Anderson. When you see this, he said, what goes through your mind? Meghan looked up at the images, her expression unreadable. It makes me sad, she said softly. Not for me, but for what it says about society. We claim to value truth and compassion, but we reward cruelty. We build people up only to break them down. And then we wonder why they stop trusting us. Anderson nodded, his tone softer now. You sound angry. Meghan met his gaze. "I'm not angry," she said. "I'm tired. There's a difference." That simple line carried the weight of years of headlines, of accusations, of living under constant watch. The studio went silent again, heavy with empathy and discomfort in equal measure. Anderson's next words came quietly, almost gently. "If you could say one thing to those who criticize you most harshly, what would it be?" She paused. "That they don't know me," she said. "They know a version built by strangers. I wish they'd stop trying to hate someone they've never met." It was the first truly vulnerable moment of the broadcast. Her voice trembled slightly, and for a brief second the strength she carried gave way to humanity. Anderson's expression softened, but his professionalism didn't waver. "And what about those who say you've hurt others in telling your truth?" "That pain caused more pain?" Meghan blinked slowly. "Pain isn't linear," she said. "Sometimes telling the truth hurts people, but silence hurts everyone." Anderson's eyes narrowed slightly. "So you stand by everything you've said publicly?" "I stand by what's real," she replied, "and what's real doesn't change because people don't like it." The words hung in the air like the closing note of a symphony. For a moment Anderson said nothing. He simply observed her, the determination, the fatigue, the unwavering will to be seen as she chose to be seen. Finally, he nodded. "That's a bold statement," he said. "And a complicated one." Meghan's tone softened again. "Everything worth saying is complicated." The producer signaled for another break, but Anderson lifted a hand. "Hold for one more minute." He turned back to Meghan. "Before we pause, I want to ask you something personal," he said. "If you could go back and speak to yourself before all of this, before the palace, before the fame, before the fallout, what would you tell her?" Meghan looked away for a moment, eyes unfocused, as if she were searching somewhere distant. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, deliberate, and stripped of all performance. "I'd tell her to trust her instincts," she said, "to know that being kind doesn't mean being weak. And that no matter how much they try to rewrite your story, your truth will outlast their noise." The studio stayed silent for several seconds after she finished. Anderson, usually the master of quick transitions, didn't rush it. He let the moment breathe, understanding that it had weight beyond words. Finally, he looked into the camera. "We'll be right back." The red tally light dimmed again, and the studio exhaled collectively. The sound of shuffling papers, low murmurs, and the faint hum of the monitors filled the space. In the booth, one of the senior producers turned to her colleague. "That wasn't an interview," she said quietly. "That was a reckoning," and she was right. On the surface, it had been calm. No shouting, no walkouts, no dramatic exits. But the quiet, composed confrontation between Anderson Cooper and Meghan Markle had carried more tension than chaos ever could. Meghan adjusted her blazer, sat upright again, and stared straight ahead at the camera that was about to come back on. Her heart was steady now. The fear had faded, replaced by resolve. Anderson glanced briefly at her from across the table. There was no hostility in his eyes, only respect for the battle they were both waging in real time. The next words spoken on air would decide who truly owned the story. The countdown began again. 5, 4, 3, 2, and with the faint click of the tally light turning red, the world tuned in once more. The final segment began with a silence that felt almost deliberate. There was no quick banter, no warm greeting as the show came back from break. The camera framed both Anderson Cooper and Meghan Markle in a tight two-shot. The air was still. The entire studio seemed to sense that whatever happened next would define how the world remembered this interview. Anderson sat upright, his expression thoughtful but controlled. Meghan adjusted slightly in her chair, shoulders squared, eyes steady. Her face carried that same polished calm as before, but underneath it was something harder, determination mixed with fatigue. Both of them looked like people who knew they were standing at the center of a moment far bigger than themselves. Anderson spoke first. His tone was calm, steady, almost cautious. "We've covered a lot of ground today," he said. "Your life, your challenges, and your perspective on fame and purpose. I want to close with something broader. When you think about how the public sees you, do you believe that perception can ever change?" Meghan gave a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "People change their minds when they want to," she said. "But I've learned not to wait for that. I'm not here to convince anyone anymore. I'm here to keep doing the work that matters." Anderson nodded. "And yet you're sitting here today, speaking directly to the same audience you say you've stopped trying to convince. Isn't that a contradiction?" The words were quiet, but the meaning hit with force. Meghan's smile faltered. She took a small breath before answering. "No," she said softly. "It's not a contradiction, it's a reminder. You can stop chasing approval and still speak your truth." Anderson leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table. "But truth is subjective, isn't it? My truth, your truth, their truth. Everyone claims to own one. How can people trust any of them?" Meghan looked at him for a long moment. "Because real truth doesn't need to be defended," she said. "It survives the noise. I can't make people believe it. I can only live it." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have. Anderson sat back slowly, letting her words hang in the air. He could have ended it there. He could have thanked her and wrapped up the show on a note of respect and professionalism. But Anderson Cooper had built his career on going one question deeper than anyone else. He glanced down at his notes, then looked up again. "You've spoken about truth and compassion," he said, "but what about accountability? Some of your critics say that while you demand empathy, you rarely offer it in return. That you frame your story as pain caused by others without admitting the pain your choices may have caused them. What do you say to that?" The question was surgical and the reaction was instant. Meghan blinked, her body tensing just slightly. "Accountability works both ways," she said evenly. "I've acknowledged mistakes, but I won't take responsibility for lies told about me. The people who hurt me the most still haven't admitted what they did." Anderson's tone remained calm. "But you've spoken publicly about them. You've named names, you've told your side. Some might argue that continuing to revisit it only reopens old wounds for everyone involved." Meghan's lips pressed together before she answered. "It's not revisiting, it's clarity. The truth doesn't expire because people are uncomfortable hearing it." Anderson nodded slightly. "Do you ever worry that saying these things on platforms like this, right here, on live television, fuels the same cycle of publicity you say you dislike?" Her answer came slower now. "I used to worry about that," she said, "but silence gave them power, speaking gives me peace. I can live with attention, I can't live with distortion." Anderson's eyes stayed fixed on her. "But you're a public figure. Doesn't some distortion come with the territory?" Her tone sharpened. "Distortion shouldn't be the price of visibility. The press likes to call it the cost of fame, but it's actually the cost of cruelty." For a moment, Anderson didn't respond. His expression stayed composed, but the weight of the conversation had clearly shifted again. The control of tone, the back and forth of words, everything felt fragile now. He said quietly, "You've spoken a lot about compassion, truth, and voice. But some people see today's interview as defiance, not compassion. How would you define what just happened here?" Meghan leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I'd call it honesty," she said. "Not defiance, not drama, just honesty. It's uncomfortable because people aren't used to hearing it from women like me, especially women who refuse to smile through being misunderstood." Anderson gave a small nod. "Do you think being misunderstood has helped you or hurt you?" "Both," she said. "It's made me stronger, but it's also isolated me. People think strength makes you untouchable. It doesn't. It just means you keep going even when you're tired." There was another pause, long enough for the audience to absorb her words. Then Anderson said, "And are you tired?" Meghan looked directly at him. "Yes," she said quietly. "But I'm not finished." The answer struck with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Anderson, for the first time that morning, looked slightly moved. His eyes softened, and he nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the human truth beneath all the noise. He spoke again, his voice lower now. "You've faced more public scrutiny than most people could handle. If you had to describe what you've learned from all of it in one sentence, what would it be?" Meghan didn't hesitate. "That you can lose everything and still keep your dignity." Anderson looked down at his desk for a moment before glancing back toward the camera. "That's a strong closing line," he said softly. But before he could transition to ending the interview, Meghan spoke again. Her tone was calm, but there was something final in it. "People talk about me like I'm a symbol," she said. "A symbol of rebellion, or ambition, or hypocrisy, depending on who's speaking. But I'm just a person who refused to stay quiet in a system that thrives on silence. Maybe that's what really scares people." Anderson paused for a long moment. "You think people are afraid of you?" "I think they're afraid of what I represent," she said. "Because once one woman refuses to play the role she was assigned, others start asking why they should play theirs." It was the kind of line that would be replayed on television for days to come. The crew in the booth exchanged quick glances, knowing they had just witnessed the defining soundbite of the morning. Anderson nodded slowly. "So where do you go from here?" he asked. Meghan smiled faintly. "Forward," she said. "Always forward." For the first time since the interview began, Anderson's face softened fully. "Well," he said, "I think we've just witnessed something rare and unfiltered moment. Thank you for being here." "Thank you for having me," she replied. The music swelled quietly as the camera panned out. The segment should have ended there, with the usual professionalism of a broadcast fade. But the world beyond the studio was already reacting. Within minutes, social media platforms lit up with clips of the interview. Viewers argued fiercely online, some praising Meghan's composure and strength, others accusing her of self-indulgence. Hashtags trended worldwide. Anderson Cooper and Meghan Markle CNN topped the charts within the hour. At CNN headquarters, producers watched the numbers climb on the monitors. Viewership had spiked during the third segment and hadn't dropped since. One of the senior executives walked past the control room and muttered, "Whatever that was, it just made history." Inside the studio, after the cameras cut, the silence felt strange, like the air after a thunderstorm. Anderson reached out his hand. Meghan shook it firmly, but neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Anderson said quietly, "That was intense." Meghan gave a tired but polite smile. "Truth usually is," he nodded. "You handled yourself well." "So did you," she said. The exchange was simple, but it carried mutual respect. Two professionals who had walked a tightrope and made it to the other side without falling. When Meghan stood to leave, the crew stepped aside. She walked past the cameras, past the cables and monitors, out into the hallway where her publicist was waiting. The moment she stepped through the studio doors, she could already hear the alerts buzzing on her phone. The world was reacting in real time. She didn't check them. She simply exhaled and kept walking. Anderson remained seated at the desk for a long moment after she left. His producers began gathering papers and unplugging headsets, but he didn't move. He stared down at his notes, at the lines he hadn't even got to ask. Then he folded them neatly and set them aside. Later that day, CNN replayed the interview in full during its primetime block. The response was unprecedented. Viewers around the world debated every word. Some accused Anderson of being too harsh, others said he had shown restraint. Meghan's supporters hailed her for standing her ground, while critics claimed she had exposed her contradictions yet again. But no one could deny that the broadcast had captured something real, the uneasy collision between two forces. Media and individual, scrutiny and self-definition, truth and perception. By evening, news outlets everywhere carried the story. Headlines read, "Anderson Cooper challenges Meghan Markle intense CNN interview," and viewers divided after explosive CNN segment. Clips dominated the front pages of entertainment sites and political blogs alike. At home in Montecito, Meghan sat in her garden with a cup of tea, finally alone. The ocean breeze rustled the trees, the faint sound of waves echoing in the distance. She knew the storm of headlines would rage for days, but for now she let herself breathe. She had said what she wanted to say. She had faced one of the sharpest interviewers in the world and hadn't crumbled. Whatever came next, she could live with it. Across the country in his Manhattan apartment, Anderson Cooper rewatched the segment later that night. He rarely did that. Usually, once an interview ended, he moved on. But something about this one stayed with him. He studied her answers, her posture, the moments of silence that had said more than her words. There was strength there, yes, but also weariness, the kind of weariness that comes from years of carrying other people's narratives. He turned off the television and sat for a while in the dark. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "That's what real journalism looks like." The next morning, CNN released the full, unedited version of the interview online. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed millions of times. Universities discussed it in media ethics courses. Talk shows debated whether Anderson had been too bold or whether Meghan had proven her composure once and for all. In the days that followed, one image circulated more than any other, a still frame from the final minute of the interview. Meghan sitting straight, her expression calm, her eyes unwavering. Anderson looking back at her, silent, both of them framed by light. For many, that single image captured the moment better than any headline could. Two people, two worlds, one conversation that refused to stay contained. And when the noise finally began to fade, one truth remained clear. It wasn't the confrontation that made people watch. It was the quiet honesty that survived it. For Meghan, that was enough. And somewhere inside CNN, Anderson Cooper closed his notebook, turned off his microphone, and smiled faintly to himself. Television had done what it rarely does anymore. It had stopped pretending and simply told the truth.